So, Vanessa, this week we're going to start analysis of the focus group transcripts, and I am curious what what's your first step of the analysis process? What do you do?
For sure. Um, so after I get my transcript, my first step is just to read through, do a first pass, and really familiarize myself with the conversation, with the content. I want to get that zoomed in, close look at the content. And I tend to keep a research journal. I find it really helpful. So I have kind of this separate journal where I like to kind of document my thought processes along the way. And so I would start that right at the beginning, where I'm just jotting down things that I've noticed, things that are standing out to me. And then the reflexive piece for that is also writing down any of the thought processes around that. Like, why do I think that stood out to me? What does that say about me as a researcher, about my priorities, about my own situatedness? And I think it's just a good practice to get into because we are situated as researchers. We are not neutral. We're not objective. We're very much in the situation we're studying, and we're going to have some different interpretations. So that can really help, especially with collaborative work, for us to be able to share our thought processes around why a certain theme came up for us or a certain idea. I also document any curiosities that I have. What do I want to know more about? Ooh, what seemed really interesting to me? And what I do often is I take the transcript and then I have some separate columns. And so I'll start with one separate column where I can just jot down those first impressions, first pass, what's a theme that that might apply to this content. And I'm not super picky about words there. I'm not, really trying to be refined or I don't know, come to a common theme at that point. I'm just writing down like what word or what kind of sentence or short blurb would I put that captures kind of what's going on here. And I would continue to do that throughout. And then later, I can go through that and refine that. So looking at how does this fit with this? Could they be put together into a theme? Is there a pattern here? And then, of course, later on, as we refine those themes, we start to look at the relationships between them. And we'd have another column where we would start to categorize those themes. So, how do they fit together? Do they fit together? What are the relationships they have? And then as part of that process, because this is collaborative work, even after that first initial pass, I like to kind of share them with my colleagues and see what they had, with the fellow researchers. And then we can talk through. And that's, again, where that research journal comes in handy, because I can look back and say, oh, what was my decision making around that? Why did I think that was important? Because they came up with something different. Or it looks like they came up with something similar. Were we on the same page with that? Because I think both the similarities in what we're finding as well as the differences are really interesting and important parts of the analysis. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I just went on mute because someone is using the leaf blower outside. Yeah, thank you, Vanessa. That's great. So I think in our first pass assignment for this week, we'll start with the transcripts in a table in Google Docs and have one separate column like you're suggesting, in which students will and co-researchers will go through and note. They'll use some questions to note. What am I more curious about? What struck me? What shifted my thinking? What do I see emerging in the data? What patterns or themes? And also like kind of highlight, are there specific quotes that stood out to
Totally. Yeah. That was another thing that I didn't mention, but you can be doing that kind of right away. And then at the end as well, right, to go through and keep track of any quotes that you think really capture something important, something that you want to share,
Yeah.
And
go ahead.
I just wanted to say the other thing that's important in this process is to make note of or highlight any of those curiosities, anything that seems like it could be important to your research question, even if only one person said that, or, it seemed kind of like it didn't fit with the other things. Because we're not just looking for frequency, we're not just looking for common themes. We're also looking for some of those divergent or unique themes, like, that might seem strange, because that could be really interesting in the end result as well.
Okay. And I just wanted to reflect on a couple things that I've heard you also talk about, and that I think is important to note about this in terms of important elements about the trustworthiness of our analysis. And one thing that you talked about is, as we have the use of the collaborative piece of having multiple people coming in and looking at the same information, different people may interpret it in different ways. And so that is the concept of triangulation, that it helps us to see more perspectives. So but the important part is just really documenting how we're going through that process, so anyone reading it would understand how we came to the interpretation we did. Not that we're saying it's the right interpretation or not, but we've triangulated it, we've gotten more people viewing it to share different ways of looking at what that might mean. And I think you also in the class last week talked about that this is an important step to just prompt dialogue. So we're not, again, claiming a truth in our interpretation of the data, but we are inviting other people to also read it for their interpretation or meaning, and prompt dialogue through that. The other thing that I wanted to just note is that I think a good next step for after we finish the first pass of the analysis is doing what's called member check, right? How do we, and Mr. Buddy had suggested that we have another call with some of the research participants to kind of go over how we're coming up with, and share with them kind of what themes are emerging and what questions people have, and get their input and their conclusions about the data. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great practice. That's something I tend to do, when I have transcripts, I give them back to the participants right away to get them to, have a look and see if there's anything that they also want redacted or are uncomfortable with. So it depends on the kind of research that you're doing. But then, after I'm kind of developing those themes, to check with them, how does this fit? Does this make sense to you? And for sure with the final research product, when I've kind of represented these themes and the way they fit together, then I would want to hear from the participants and see how it fits for them, how it doesn't, what they might change. And I take that quite seriously as well, because we're trying to represent them and their voices. And of course we're doing some interpretive work, we always are. But that's more of a dialogue back and forth, where we can come to a shared understanding.
Okay, great.
That's pretty valuable. Yeah.
And I think this process that you kind of laid out will really help if we make that transparent to anyone who would be reading the research findings report. It would help increase the dependability of how did we get to these shared themes or these themes and these insights. So that people can trust our insights, collective insights from the group.
So there you can say we've done triangulation and member checking throughout, and that can really increase the trustworthiness, the dependability of your research, and show, like you said, being very transparent and explicit about those processes.
Another one that I think you really led us in last week that was so important was the process of reflexivity, and you talked about that in the beginning. So you talked about I'm noticing this. Why am I noticing this? What's my, what are the assumptions that I brought into this research? So it helps us examine our own maybe potential biases or assumptions or situatedness, the privilege or the power. We've been talking about that we're bringing into it, or our specific lens or experience. And I think the peer check also helps with that.
Absolutely.
So if the students and our co-researchers, as they're going through this, are able to say I'm curious about how you came to that interpretation. Help me understand that more, really will help us highlight maybe what might be potential blind spots or biases that we bring into the analysis, or try to understand the different ways that we're interpreting what someone has said. So
absolutely. And it kind of exposes some of the hidden assumptions that we carry. And by exposing them, I mean also to ourselves, because when I say assumptions, I mean those are things we often take for granted. And so part of that process is uncovering them for ourselves. And it's not necessarily about doing away with them. We can't possibly do away with all of our, biases, our assumptions, our positionality. It's, we're tied to it. But to make it more evident, more visible to us, so we can understand how it's influencing our processes and in what way. And then we can manage it depending on, we're not getting rid of it. We're kind of working with it. We're managing it. And I think, like you said, that peer piece, the collaborative piece really helps bring in the multiple meanings that can help keep those assumptions in check. But
and I really love how you've invited us to think of ourselves as like critical researchers when we're looking at a position, a certain research that there's a social justice element. You know, there are
Hmm.
voices that have been often left out of research or marginalized in certain ways, or
Hmm.
um, you know, in many different ways, because of age or ableism. A lot of the isms that we've talked about, racism, ageism, ableism, may not have been, their voices may not have been privileged, that it's so important for us as researchers to actively seek out that peer check so
Yep.
that we are what we might call like being relationally responsive. And
Yep.
in each moment, like we are really attending to the relationship that is being built, and in this research, the relationship with the participants and the research team, and moving forward in a way that we feel is disrupting
Yep.
traditional research processes that often kind of hold that power and privilege of the research expert voice in place.
Exactly. And actually, as you were highlighting that, I was thinking back to the comment I made about also taking note of the things that might be different. They're not, common themes.
Mhm.
And that's part of that process as well. Because let's say you're looking at 10 people and one person had a very different account or different experience. We don't just want to discard them and say, oh, well, because you didn't have, the dominant experience,
Mhm.
or, the common experience, the normative experience, therefore it's not valuable information,
Mhm.
because we can further alienate, and
Mhm.
pave over, ignore,
Mhm.
silence the experiences
Silence.
of people just because they're, not part of the dominant majority. And that's not a
Yeah.
practice we want to reproduce. So,
I just really love that, because I think that, I always think about Gregory Bateson saying the difference is in the difference. Like,
mhm,
where do we find the innovation? Where do we find the opportunities for, um, how we might, I want to say like how
yeah.
we might go on together, throw in some Wittgenstein in there too. But how do we really lift up those differences within the
Yeah.
research as well? And often we look for the common themes, what's similar, and really
Yes.
where a lot of the insight might be is in the differences.
Exactly. And for me, that's a both and situation,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
Because Bateson also says, what is the pattern that connects, right? So we're looking
Mm,
for that, right? We're looking for that. But
nice.
we're also looking for the complexities of patterns,
Mhm,
and that includes difference. And I see
mhm,
difference as very valuable. I think it was Audre Lorde who said, we need to see difference as a springboard for creative change, as a
mm,
source of power, and not be afraid of the differences between us. And I
mm,
really try to bring that into the way that I look at research,
uh-huh,
and trying to represent, difference and different opinions, different experiences,
mhm,
perspectives, because I do see them as catalytic,
mhm.
as very sites of generative potential, let's say.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, I'm super excited. I think if we close out this conversation with Audre Lorde, we're in good shape.
Hey, yeah. You know what? Always relevant. Always relevant.
Okay, thank you so much, Vanessa, again, for all of
Yep.
your insight as we move forward in this research project.
No problem.